before numbers had names. Long before anyone whispered the word mathematics, the world moved quietly with its own patient rhythm. Days unfolded one after another, the sun rising and setting in a slow, predictable arc. Seasons returned with familiar smells, the damp scent of flooded riverbanks, the dry whisper of harvested fields, the cool breath of night over stone and clay. No one called these patterns data. No one spoke of equations or geometry. Yet the patterns were there, steady and gentle, repeating themselves like a lullaby that had been playing since the beginning of time. In a broad valley between slow, winding rivers, people lived in mud brick houses that warmed in the sun and cooled at night. Smoke rose in thin, sleepy threads from cooking fires. Children chased each other between the houses and through the fields, leaving shallow footprints in the soft dirt. Goats and sheep moved like drifting clouds, their bells making small, irregular chimes. At first, no one tried to count them. A flock was simply many, and many was enough. But the rivers rose and fell each year. When the waters withdrew, they left rich, dark soil behind. In that soil, seeds disappeared, then returned as wheat and barley, high and golden. If the flood was gentle and predictable, the harvest was generous. If the flood was too low or too wild, the harvest faltered. People began to watch the water with a quiet, cautious attention. That attention was the first soft footstep of mathematics. In one of those river cities, where boats drifted by like slow-moving shadows, there lived an older man whose hair had begun to turn the color of dry straw. He was not a warrior or a merchant. He sat most days in a shaded room near a courtyard, where the sound of water trickling in a basin blended with distant voices. In front of him lay cool, smooth pieces of clay, still damp and waiting. His name does not matter now. The world has forgotten it. But his hands, and the marks he pressed into tablets, carried part of the quiet beginning of mathematics. He was a scribe. When the merchant from the grain storehouse came to him, he brought worry with him, like dust on his sandals. The merchant explained slowly that grain went out, grain came in, and promises were made, yet by the end of each season, arguments still rose like heat from the ground. Had too much grain left? Had too little arrived? Had someone taken more than they should? The scribe listened. He did not rush. Outside, a fly drifted lazily in the warm air, circling, landing, and circling again. The scribe picked up a small stylus of sharpened reed. He did not yet do algebra or calculate sums. He only knew that the clay kept what the mind could not hold forever. He pressed a single wedge-shaped mark into the surface, then another. Each mark stood for something, a measure of grain, a jar, a sack, a promise. 1 mark. 2 marks. 3. He did not think, I am inventing a number system. He simply knew that when the merchant returned, confused and uncertain, the clay would still remember what had been agreed upon. The clay would not forget. As he worked, the city around him went on with its slow breathing. Women carried water from the well. Donkeys moved through narrow streets with baskets hanging from their sides. At the river, a boatman tied his reed boat to a worn stone post and stretched his back, the rope creaking softly as it grew taut. Far above, the sky turned from bright white to a gentle gold. In time it would sink into soft purple, then a deep blue sprinkled with distant, shimmering lights, stars that had been drawing their own invisible diagrams long before any human eyes looked up and wondered. The scribe had no words for abstraction. He was not trying to discover a universal law. All he wanted was a way to say this amount and that amount and no more than this. And so he marked. He made groups of wedges for small quantities, different shapes for larger ones. Sometimes, when the quantities grew too large, he grouped the symbols together in new ways. It felt clumsy, like rearranging stones until they fit into a neat line. But the clay accepted every mark without complaint. When he finished a tablet, he set it aside to dry, then began another. Days passed. Seasons shifted. Arguments quieted, just a little, when people could point to a solid slab of clay and say, "Here. This is what we agreed." Mathematics was not born in a bright flash of insight or a thunderclap of discovery. It slipped in softly, between one wedge-shaped mark and the next, between the worry of a merchant and the patience of a scribe. It grew out of the simple desire not to forget. At night, when the city fell still and only a few scattered lamps glowed against the darkness, the older man sometimes sat alone in the courtyard, his fingers still carrying traces of dried clay. He looked up at the sky, where the same stars appeared in the same patterns, night after night. He did not yet think of angles or spheres, distances or orbits. He only felt a faint comfort in the way the stars returned, steady and reliable, like friends who never forgot their way home. Somewhere between the river's flood and the sky's quiet repetition, between clay tablets and careful hands, something gentle and invisible was taking shape. It would not have a single birthplace, nor a single inventor. It would unfold slowly, like the opening of a long, patient breath. This was the quiet beginning, the city that counted without knowing. Morning returned as it always did, with a pale light spreading across the flat rooftops and the slow stirring of the streets. Somewhere, a rooster called out once, then again, as if to be sure the day had truly arrived. The air carried the faint smell of damp earth and smoke. In the market square, people began to gather. They did not talk about systems of measurement or the standardized units. They spoke of jars and baskets, loaves and lengths of cloth. Yet, beneath their words, a quiet structure was forming, as soft and steady as the stone under their feet. A woman selling dates arranged them carefully on a woven mat. She placed them in small, neat piles, each pile the same size. Her hands moved calmly, almost automatically, as if following an unspoken rule. When someone approached, she did not think, "I have invented equal sets." She only knew that it felt fair to give each buyer the same number of dates for the same coin. In another corner of the market, a man selling clay bricks stacked them in rows. 10 bricks to a row, 3 rows to a stack. He found that when the stacks were arranged this way, they were easier to count, easier to move, easier to promise. It was not yet multiplication. It was simply a comfortable arrangement, like placing sleeping mats side by side so that everyone had enough room. The scribe from the shaded room sometimes walked through this market, his steps unhurried. He watched without announcing himself, his eyes moving from the piles of dates to the stacks of bricks, from the rows of jars to the bundles of reeds. Everywhere he looked, people were grouping, comparing, and adjusting. They did it quietly, without grand theories, guided by a sense of balance and fairness that lived in their hands more than in their words. Later, back at his low wooden table, he pressed new marks into damp clay. A shipment of grain from a distant village had arrived, and the temple had received its share. The priests wanted to know how much had come in, how much would be stored, and how much would be set aside for offerings and for those in need. The scribe began with the familiar wedge marks. But soon, the quantity grew awkward to record. The tablet filled quickly, the symbols crowding together. He paused, listening to the gentle murmur of voices outside, the occasional bray of a donkey, the far-off splash of oars. Perhaps, he thought, there could be a simpler way. He tried grouping the marks, repeating a larger symbol for a larger amount, combining them like pieces of a pattern. He did not know that future generations would look back and give names to his choices. Base systems, place values, positional notation. He only knew that his hand relaxed a little when the marks on the clay began to look more orderly, more compressed, easier to read at a glance. With each new tablet, the city's memory thickened. Agreements were no longer carried only in tired minds that could forget or in voices that could twist with anger. They lived outside human bodies, etched into clay that could be touched, stacked, and stored. In quiet storerooms, rows of tablets slowly accumulated. Some recorded grain, others recorded livestock, still others recorded debts and payments, births and deaths. Each one held patterns of marks that, taken together, formed the first faint murmurs of arithmetic. Far beyond this single city, in another land where a different river rose and fell along broad, green banks, other people faced other problems. Each year, when the waters withdrew from the fields, the edges of the farms blurred. Stones that once marked boundaries were carried away. Lines that had seemed clear were washed into soft confusion. To grow food and live in peace, they needed to redraw the land, to reclaim what had been theirs without starting arguments that could smolder like dry brush in the sun. There, too, patient eyes and careful hands began to notice something. Lengths of rope could be stretched, folded, and compared. A corner could be recreated if the sides kept their relationships. Shapes could be copied, not only by sight, but by rule. No one in those river fields spoke yet of triangles or right angles. They simply knew that if a rope was knotted at certain intervals, it could be laid out to recreate the same shape again and again. A field could be restored to its old outline, even after the water had erased it. The world did not wake up one morning and decide, today we will give birth to geometry. Instead, people woke, as they always did, to the sound of birds and the rustle of wind over water. They rose because the day required it. They measured and counted because the land and grain required it. Back in the first city, evening came softly. The scribe's room grew dim as the sun lowered, and a servant lit a small oil lamp. Its flame flickered gently, painting slow, trembling shadows on the wall. The scribe examined a tablet he had finished earlier. On it, rows of marks recorded how many jars of grain had been moved from one storehouse to another. He traced the symbols lightly with his fingertip, not to reread them, but simply to feel the quiet order they represented. There was a strange kind of peace in knowing that the tablet would remain the same tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, long after today's conversations had faded. He did not know that in distant centuries, others would look at tablets like this and call them early examples of accounting, of numerical notation, of proto-mathematics. To him, they were work tools and memory stones. Above the city, the stars returned once more, scattered across the night sky in their familiar formations. Herdsmen in the fields glanced up and recognized certain shapes among them, the same shapes their parents and grandparents had known. They used those glowing points to tell directions, to feel the passage of the seasons, to sense when it was time to sow seeds or bring animals to safer ground. They did not yet draw lines between the stars and speak of angles. They simply trusted that the sky, like the river, moved according to a rhythm that did not easily break. Slowly, very slowly, the awareness grew. Some things could be counted, some distances could be compared, some shapes could be copied and returned. The world was not pure chaos. Beneath its noise and error, there was a soft, repeating structure. Still, no one called it mathematics. The city slept. The rivers flowed. Clay dried in dark storerooms. Ropes lay coiled near fields awaiting the next flood. The stars turned in silence. Somewhere in all this quiet movement, between markets and temples, between storehouses and fields, between sky and earth, an invisible thread was being woven. It connected the counting of dates, the stacking of bricks, the recording of grain, and the remeasuring of fields. The thread did not shine. It did not demand attention. It simply held things together, patiently waiting for the day when people would finally notice it, give it a name, and follow it into deeper and deeper patterns. The rope keepers of the flooded fields. When the river swelled again in the warm season, its waters crept over the low banks, spreading across the plains like a great, shimmering blanket. From a distance, the flooded fields looked calm, almost peaceful, though everyone in the small settlements nearby understood the silent anxiety those waters held. Too high a flood, and the fields became unpredictable. Too low a flood, and the crops would starve. Most years, the river behaved, bringing life along its winding path, but each season carried its own mysteries. When the waters finally began to retreat, the land underneath emerged changed, soft, dark, and uneven. The old borders between plots of land had vanished again. Stones once placed carefully at each edge had drifted or sunk. Lines that had seemed straight the year before now waved and bowed like strings loosened from tension. This was when the rope keepers went to work. They were not priests, nor warriors, nor scholars. They were ordinary farmers, people who knew the soil and the weight of seed bags, the rhythm of harvests, the temper of the weather. But they also knew something else, something subtle. The river could erase boundaries, but patterns could restore them. Each rope keeper carried a coil of thick, knotted rope slung over the shoulder, its fibers worn smooth from years of use. The ropes were marked with tiny knots placed at regular intervals, created long ago by hands that had wanted a measure that would not vanish. No one called it standardization. They called it fair remembrance. When the first fields dried enough to walk upon, the rope keepers stepped softly onto the soil. They did not rush. The ground sank slightly beneath their feet, leaving faint impressions that others would soon follow. Their movements were slow and deliberate, matching the quiet tone of the morning as sunlight warmed the distant reeds. One rope keeper uncoiled his rope, stretching it between two men who held the ends taut. Another gently pressed a foot into the earth to anchor a corner. The rope bowed slightly in the wind, then straightened as the men adjusted their grip. No one spoke of triangles or right angles. They only recalled what their elders had taught. When this rope bends in this way, and these knots line up, the corner stays true. They repeated these actions field after field, year after year. Though they did not know it, they were safeguarding the earliest quiet steps of geometry. Nearby, children watched with the lingering curiosity of those too young to understand but too alert to ignore. They saw how the rope, when folded in certain patterns, returned to its original shape. They saw how the same knots brought the same outlines, regardless of how the river had shifted the year before. Sometimes a child would ask, "Why that shape?" And the rope keepers answered simply, "Because it brings peace." Peace, not accuracy, not method, was the word that mattered. Peace meant fewer arguments between neighbors. Peace meant harvests that matched expectations. Peace meant no one claimed more land than they had before. Over time, the rope keepers' work spread into quiet stories. People spoke of how a rope could tame the river's forgetfulness, how it could restore what had almost been lost. Travelers carried the idea from one settlement to another, explaining not the mathematics behind it, but the trust that came from using the same measures, the same shapes, the same lengths. Meanwhile, in the distant city where the scribe worked, clay tablets piled higher. The marks on them grew slightly more structured each season, as if mirroring the tidy outlines the rope keepers traced across their land. None of these groups, neither the scribes nor the rope keepers, knew of the other. Yet the quiet birth of mathematics was unfolding along different rivers, through different hands, bound together not by intention but by need. At dusk, when the rope keepers finished their work for the day, the sun sank low across the fields, turning the still wet soil a soft, glowing brown. They gathered the ropes again, coiling them slowly, respectfully. A rope could last a lifetime, sometimes longer. Some ropes had outlived the hands that made them. Returning to their homes, they left behind outlines faintly etched into the ground, lines that would guide planting, feeding, harvesting, and the night ledger of the sky. Far above the rope keepers, above the river valleys and the slowly rebuilding fields, the sky began its nightly transformation. Pale streaks of daylight thinned and dissolved into a soft blue, then a deeper blue, until the first bright star appeared, a small spark against the vast, dark canvas. For as long as anyone could remember, the stars had been companions to the night. They were neither feared nor worshipped in this city by the river. They were simply there, steady and faithful. In a world where rivers could shift, crops could fail, and storms could come without warning, the sky felt like the most consistent ledger of all. Herdsmen in the outskirts were always the first to notice the changes. They guided their flocks back toward wooden pens, watching how the constellations appeared in familiar arrangements. When a certain cluster rose just after sunset, they knew the nights would soon turn warmer. When another dipped low near the horizon, they knew rains were coming. They could not have explained how these patterns worked, they only trusted that the stars remembered. Back in the city, the scribe often stepped into his courtyard at night after finishing a tablet. His small oil lamp flickered beside him, casting a soft circle of light on the clay floor. Beyond that circle, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint sound of crickets. He tilted his head back and looked upward. The stars lay across the sky in sweeping arcs and gentle lines. They were not yet coordinates or vectors or distances. They were quiet markers of time, appearing in cycles so long and smooth that one had to watch them for years to truly feel their rhythm. The scribe did not keep formal track of the stars, but he had begun to notice small coincidences. When certain stars shifted slightly westward, the river floods were near. When others rose later than usual, the cold winds followed soon after. He wondered what this meant, though not in a scientific sense. He felt only that the sky was keeping its own kind of record, a record as patient and enduring as the clay tablets he shaped each day. Sometimes, he brought a tablet outside with him after the day's writing was done. Setting it on the ground, he traced the last mark gently with his fingertip, then looked at the sky again. There was something comforting in knowing that both the clay and the stars preserved what had happened. Clay remembered numbers. The sky remembered seasons. And perhaps, he thought, memory itself had patterns. One evening, after a day filled with measuring and marking, he lingered outside longer than usual. The city had grown quiet. Only the distant echo of a closing gate and the soft bells of wandering animals remained. Above him, the stars drifted in slow procession. He noticed 3 bright points forming a shape he had never truly observed before, a line that looked almost intentional, almost like the rope keeper's straight edges. He did not draw the line. He simply followed it with his eyes, feeling a subtle order in the vast, unreachable distance. It was the first time he felt that perhaps the sky and the earth spoke the same silent language. Elsewhere in the city, priests prepared for seasonal rituals. They watched the sky not for beauty but for guidance. They recorded nothing on clay, yet they remembered which stars marked the beginning of certain ceremonies, which predicted the return of migratory birds, which accompanied the longest or shortest days. Their memories formed another quiet pillar of early mathematics, without numbers, without diagrams, without intent. Only observation, repeated year after year until patterns emerged like faint lines in soft clay. During one particularly clear night, the scribe found himself thinking about the rope keepers, though he had never met them. He imagined how they stretched their ropes, how they restored what the river had washed away. In a strange way, the rope keepers and the stars seemed connected, both created order from uncertainty, both offered structure where there might have been confusion. He wondered if the marks he made in clay were part of the same thread. He wondered if everything, rivers, ropes, stars, tablets, was gently weaving itself into one quiet fabric of understanding. He did not have the language for it. The world was still centuries away from naming such things. But he felt the idea settle softly in his mind, like dust drifting to the floor. Patterns everywhere. Patterns guiding life. Patterns waiting to be recognized. As he extinguished his small oil lamp and prepared to sleep, a final thought passed through him. Perhaps someday someone will gather all these, the clay rooms where memory slept. The sun drifted across the sky in its unhurried arc, casting long, steady lines of light through the narrow openings of the storehouse. Inside, the cool air held the scent of clay, dried tablets stacked neatly against the walls, new ones laid out on low wooden shelves, and damp ones resting on woven mats, waiting for the final touch of the scribe's reed stylus. The clay rooms were quiet even during the busiest seasons. Sounds from the city, merchants calling out prices, donkeys clattering over stone paths, children laughing as they chased each other, seemed to soften the moment they crossed the threshold, as if the air itself lowered its voice in respect for the tablets resting there. This was where memory slept. Not the kind held in human minds, which tired, blurred, argued, and shifted. The clay held a different kind of memory, cold, stubborn, and faithful. Once a mark was pressed into it and left to dry, it remained long after the hand that made it was gone. In these rooms, everything that mattered was stored: grain deliveries, harvest counts, shipments from distant villages, temple offerings, borrowing promises, repayment agreements. But something curious had been happening over the seasons. The tablets were no longer just records, they were beginning to resemble small fragments of an order that even the scribe could not fully articulate. Sometimes, when he arranged the tablets on the shelf, he noticed how certain markings repeated in predictable ways. A wedge shape followed by another meant something small, a different shape meant something larger. When tablets spoke of the same goods or same amounts, their symbols aligned almost like musical notes repeating the same melody. He did not think of this as data consistency or numerical notation. He thought only that the tablets seemed to calm one another when arranged properly, as though placing similar patterns together made the room quieter. He often walked among the shelves with his hands clasped behind his back, listening to the silence. There was a sensation, hard to name, that the clay was whispering something. Not words, but structure. Not instructions, but rhythm. One morning, a young assistant entered the clay room with a basket of freshly shaped tablets. His arms were thin, his steps cautious as he set the basket down. He looked uncertain. "Where should I place these?" he asked. The scribe studied him for a moment. The boy was new, only a few weeks into his work, and still overwhelmed by the responsibilities. The storehouse held more tablets than he had ever seen, so many that he had joked once that if he spent his entire life reading them, he would finish only a fraction. The scribe approached the basket and picked up one tablet. Its marks were simple, recording 10 jars of oil delivered to the temple kitchens. He walked to a particular shelf and set it beside another tablet bearing similar marks. The boy blinked. "Why there?" The scribe touched the row gently. "Because it belonged with these." The boy frowned. "Is that a rule?" "Not a rule," the scribe said softly. "Just something that keeps the room at peace." The boy didn't fully understand. But he nodded, feeling that this place had its own quiet logic, a logic that lived in the arrangement, the grouping, the structure. He followed the scribe down another row. This time, the scribe lifted a tablet containing a larger amount of grain. It felt heavier, not because the clay weighed more, but because the number recorded on it carried more responsibility. This tablet he placed on a higher shelf, where the biggest accounts were kept. Though the assistant did not notice, the scribe had arranged the shelves in such a way that tablets implicitly followed a sequence. Small amounts on the lower left, larger amounts rising upward and to the right, like a slow invisible slope that no one but the scribe understood fully. He had not planned this arrangement. It had emerged naturally, season after season, shelf after shelf, pattern after pattern. One afternoon, as a soft breeze drifted through the clay room, the scribe traced the symbols on a particularly old tablet. Its marks were faint, worn down by time. It recorded a simple transaction long forgotten: 3 sacks of grain traded for a small bundle of copper. But what fascinated the scribe was the clarity of the symbols. They were almost identical to the symbols used today, though this tablet was far older than any he regularly handled. Something stirred in him then, a realization that even without intending to, people had been stabilizing the shapes of their symbols, repeating them consistently enough that generations apart could still read them. It was a kind of quiet standardization, born not from decree but from habit, memory, and the calming desire to repeat what worked. That afternoon, he sat alone at his table, feeling the weight of that discovery. He did not smile or speak. He simply rested his hands on the table and let the thoughts settle. Patterns in the city's trade. Patterns in the rope-keeper's fields. Patterns in the stars overhead. Patterns in the symbols pressed into clay. Everywhere he looked, the world was gently teaching itself to remember. The scribe picked up his stylus, dipped it into water to clean its tip, and positioned a new tablet in front of him. As he pressed the first mark, he felt something shift quietly inside, an awareness that he was not merely writing for merchants or priests. He was writing for the future, though he did not know it. The clay accepted the mark. Then another. And another. Outside, the city continued its calm. The traveler who saw patterns in different lands. The story of mathematics was not confined to one city or one river. While the scribe shaped his clay and rope keepers restored their fields, the world beyond their borders moved with its own rhythm. Traders crossed deserts with caravans, sailors steered wooden boats across gentle seas, and wanderers walked from settlement to settlement, carrying stories, ideas, and questions. One such traveler arrived in the river city during the late dry season. He wore a long woven cloak, bleached in places by the sun and stained darker where the rains had caught him. His sandals were thin, his pack light. Around his neck hung a simple charm of polished stone that glinted whenever he moved. He came not with demands but with curiosity, asking gentle questions and listening carefully to every answer. People called him by different names depending on where he went, but most simply referred to him as the listener, because he seemed more interested in observing than telling. His voice was soft, his steps unhurried, and his gaze held a kind of stillness that made others feel comfortable speaking freely around him. When he entered the marketplace, he paused to watch a woman arranging her dates into tidy rows. He watched a merchant weigh copper using hanging scales made of wood and string. He watched children draw shapes in the dust with sticks, circles, and squares, though they did not call them by such names. He spent 3 days wandering like this, absorbing everything quietly. Then one evening, as the sun began to dip and the market thinned, he approached the scribe's doorway. The scribe looked up from his tablet, his hand still coated in a thin layer of damp clay. "May I sit with you?" the traveler asked. The scribe nodded. He sensed immediately that this stranger carried patience in his voice, the kind of patience that matched the clay room itself. The traveler sat on the low stool opposite the scribe, watching as the stylus pressed its marks. "I have seen markings like these," the traveler said softly, though not exactly the same. "In another land, far past the mountains, they press different shapes, curved ones, sometimes, or small circles. But they use them the same way." The scribe paused. "To remember." The traveler smiled faintly. "Yes. To remember amounts, promises, agreements." The scribe rested the stylus on the table. "Do their floods erase boundaries as ours do?" The traveler shook his head. "No flood. Their land is dry. But their cattle wander far, and the herds must be recorded or they are lost. They keep lists on clay slabs, much like yours. The scribe felt something shift inside him, as though a small window had opened to reveal a larger world. He had always believed that his city's ways were shaped entirely by the river, the floods, the soil, the seasons. Yet here was a man who spoke of different landscapes, different challenges, and yet the same solution, symbols pressed into clay to carry memory beyond the limits of the human mind. How can their symbols resemble ours? The scribe asked quietly, more to himself than to the traveler. The traveler folded his hands. Because when people try to remember, they reach for patterns. When people try to share, they reach for clarity. The symbols become what the hands find easiest to repeat. He paused, gazing out at the quiet street. I think these patterns exist long before we understand them. The scribe absorbed those words slowly. They felt true in a way that resonated with the clay tablets, with the rope keeper's work, with the movement of the stars above. Does every land seek patterns? He asked. Every land I have seen, the traveler answered gently. Some measure the land. Some measure the herds. Some measure the sky. Some measure time. But all of them measure something. The scribe leaned back, feeling the weight of this realization settle inside him as gently as dust. He had spent so much of his life believing he was performing a craft specific to his city, yet now he saw that he was part of something much larger. Something that flowed across rivers and deserts, something that threaded itself through the hands of many people living far apart. The traveler stayed in the city for several days. He visited the clay rooms, walked through the fields where farmers prepared for planting, and sat with the elders by their evening fires. Everywhere he went, he asked quiet questions. Everywhere he listened. And everywhere he found the same thing: repetition, grouping, comparing, measuring. On his final night, he sat once more with the scribe. The courtyard was cool, the oil lamp flickering softly. Above them, the constellations moved in their slow procession. You have a gift, the traveler told him. You see the order in small things. Do not lose that. I only record what others tell me, the scribe replied. No, the traveler said gently. You shape the memory of your people. And you do it the same way others shape theirs. Without knowing it, you are building bridges between distant lands. The scribe felt a calmness wash over him, not excitement, not pride, just a quiet understanding. When the traveler left at dawn, he walked toward the rising light with the same unhurried steps he had arrived with. He did not carry objects from the city, only impressions, rows of dates, ropes in the fields, marks in clay, stars reflected in the river. But he left behind a seed. A thought. A possibility. An awareness that the patterns appearing in this city were not isolated, they echoed across the world. The boy who counted shadows. The boy who worked with the scribe did not think of himself as a student of anything important. He swept the floors, carried baskets of tablets from one room to another, fetched water when the clay grew too dry. His days passed quietly, marked more by small tasks than by large ideas. Yet slowly, without noticing, he had begun to count. At first it was simple and almost unconscious. When he carried newly molded tablets from the potter's area to the clay room, he held them in stacks that felt comfortable in his hands. For tablets were easy to grip. 5 made the stack wobble. 6 risked a clumsy fall. So he favored 4. One day, while the sun slanted low through the doorway, he placed 4 damp tablets on the table with a small, satisfied exhale. Then another 4. Without intending to, he whispered to himself. 4 and 4 again. He paused, noticing the small row he had created. 8 tablets, though he did not yet say the word aloud. The scribe, who watched more than he spoke, observed this small habit from his seat. His stylus rested for a moment as he followed the boy's movements with his eyes. "Why 4?" the scribe asked at last. The boy blinked, startled. "It feels balanced," he said after a moment. 2 in each hand. Not too heavy. The scribe nodded. "So you remember 4 as a feeling in your arms?" The boy tilted his head, thinking. He had never considered that numbers might be remembered in the body, not just in the mind. That evening, when the work had slowed and the light had grown gentle and golden, the scribe called the boy to sit beside him at the table. There were no priests, no merchants, no urgent transactions waiting. Just a quiet interval between day and night. On the table lay a new piece of clay. "I want to show you something," the scribe said softly. He pressed a single wedge-shaped symbol into the clay. "This," he said, "is 1 measure. 1 jar of oil. 1 sack of grain. 1 of anything." The boy nodded. He knew this symbol. He had seen it countless times, though he had never been the one to write it. The scribe pressed another mark beside it. Then another. Then 1 more. "Now there are 4, he continued. "You feel 4 in your arms when you carry tablets. You see 4 here in the clay. Your body and the clay speak the same truth." The boy watched, a slow understanding settling over him. It felt simple, yet strangely large, like the river seen from a hilltop, peaceful, but full of power. Then the scribe did something unexpected. He gently ran the side of his hand over the 4 marks, smoothing the clay until they disappeared. The boy gasped softly. "You have erased them?" The scribe nodded. "Yes." "But are they gone from you?" The boy hesitated. "No," he said slowly. "I still remember. You pressed for marks." The scribe smiled. "So now the clay is empty, but your mind is not." He pressed for marks again. This time, he did not say the number. He only watched the boy's eyes as each symbol appeared. The boy's gaze, once scattered and uncertain, now followed the marks with increasing focus. "Could you remember this without seeing it?" the scribe asked. "If I told you 4 and 4 again?" The boy thought of the stacks of tablets he had carried. 4 and 4 again. The weight in his hands. The way his fingers curled around the edges. "That would be 8, he said quietly, almost afraid of the word as it left his lips. The scribe did not praise him loudly. He only nodded, letting the moment rest between them like a delicate clay cup that should not be shaken. "Then your hands have been teaching your mind," he said calmly. "You already knew 8 before I showed you any marks." The boy looked at the clay, then at his own hands. The thought felt strangely soothing, like realizing that a path he feared might be difficult was one he had walked many times without noticing. The scribe pressed more symbols. He showed 4 and 4, then 3 and 2, then 5 and 1. He did not name addition, did not speak of sums or totals. He simply asked the boy to feel whether the groups matched, whether the sense of how much inside him stayed the same. Sometimes the boy closed his eyes as he answered. He imagined tablets in his arms, dates in small piles, jars lined along a wall. He imagined giving 1 away, taking 1 back, splitting a group into 2 halves, then joining them again. After a while, his responses grew more confident. He still stumbled occasionally, but the pattern was becoming familiar, less like a puzzle, more like a rhythm. As night began to fall, their lamp cast a warm circle of light over the table. Outside, the city softened into darkness. Dogs settled near doorways. The river darkened, its surface reflecting only fragments of the dimming sky. The scribe smoothed the clay 1 final time. "Do you know," he said quietly, "what we did tonight?" The boy shrugged. You let me count." The scribe shook his head gently. "No. You did more. You counted without needing to see." The boy thought about that sentence for a long moment. Counting without seeing. Counting with only memory, with only a sense of how much. The idea felt like standing at the edge of something vast and calm, like looking across the river at night when the opposite bank was hidden in darkness but still certainly there. Without knowing the word, the boy had taken one of his first steps into abstraction. Later, as he lay on his sleeping mat, the day replayed in slow, drifting images, for tablets in his arms, for marks on clay, ate as a quiet certainty, not an object he could touch. His eyes grew. The first calendar of quiet moons. Far from the river city of clay rooms and rope-marked fields, in another land where the nights were cooler and the air smelled faintly of dry grass and incense, a different kind of watcher was at work. He was not a scribe, though he had seen tablets. He was not a rope keeper, though he knew the importance of boundaries. His duty was to watch the sky, especially the pale, changing moon that rose each evening with a different face. He climbed the worn steps of a stone platform each night after dusk, carrying a small oil lamp, a flat stone to sit on, and a board of hardened clay on which he etched his marks. The temple stood behind him, silent and massive, its walls holding echoes of prayers and ceremonies. Before him stretched the open plain and the sky. Each night, he looked up. The moon never stayed the same. Some nights it was a thin, sharp curve, other nights a half circle like a bowl cut in the sky, and sometimes it grew into a full, round disk that bathed the land in pale, silvery light. Then it shrank again, returning to darkness, before the cycle repeated. At first, generations before him, people had simply admired the moon without asking too many questions. It was beautiful. It was watchful. It came and went, and that was enough. But over time, they began to notice a connection. Certain ceremonies always seemed to fall under a full moon. Certain tasks, planting, harvesting, traveling, went better when timed with its gentle phases. Women in the village observed rhythms in their own bodies that seemed to follow the moon's quiet turning. The sky, it seemed, was keeping track of something. And so, the watcher's role was born. His job was simple, yet endless: observe, remember, record. Every night, he climbed the steps. Every night, he glanced at the horizon, then lifted his gaze to the glowing disk or thin sliver above. Every night, he marked what he saw. He did not know that future people would call this a calendar. He only knew that when they tied important events to the moon cycle, arguments lessened. People agreed more easily on when something should happen, because the sky offered them a shared reference no one could move or alter. On his clay board, the watcher pressed a mark each time the moon reached a certain phase. He created signs for its thin beginnings, for its half shapes, for its full, luminous roundness. As the months passed, he started to notice that the number of days between one full moon and the next was nearly the same, over and over. It was not perfect. Some cycles felt slightly longer, some shorter. Clouds sometimes hid the moon completely, forcing him to rely on memory. But overall, the pattern persisted, stubborn and calm. He began to count the days between full moons. To help himself remember, he scratched small notches into a piece of wood, one each morning when the sun rose. When the moon became full again, he counted the notches. After some time, he noticed that the count hovered around the same number. He did not give this number a grand name. He only whispered to himself, "So many days, then it returns." Gradually, the temple elders began to rely on him. Before announcing the date of an important rite, they asked, "How many nights until the next full moon?" Before sending messengers to distant villages, they asked, "How far are we into the moon's turning?" The watcher never answered with pomp or authority. He spoke slowly, quietly, because he felt that he was not truly the one giving the answers. "The sky is telling you," he often said. "I am only listening." One night, as he sat on his platform and watched the moon rise, just past half now, on its way to fullness, he considered the strange connection between his work and the lives of the people below. Marriages, harvest feasts, offerings to the gods, decisions about travel, all of them drifting into sync with the silent rhythm he had been tracking. He realized that by counting the days between the phases, he had begun to measure time itself in a more structured way. Time had always flowed, like the river, whether anyone noticed or not. But now, it had gentle markers, repeated intervals, a shape. He thought of children in the village asking, "When will the feast come?" and their parents answering, "When the moon is full, no longer soon or after some days," but anchored to a visible, shared signal in the sky. Down below, the land slept under the gradual glow. Fires dwindled in the distance. Dogs curled in doorways. Somewhere, a child looked up at the moon, too drowsy to think of its phases, only comforted by its presence. From his platform, the watcher pressed another small mark into the clay board. He began to experiment, though he did not call it that. He wondered if the moon returned after a certain number of days, and if the seasons also repeated after so many moons, might there be a quiet connection between the shorter cycles and the longer ones? He started to record not just individual moons, but groups of them. He noticed how many full moons came between the coldest nights and the warmest. He noticed that after a certain count, the wind shifted, the light changed, and the world felt new again. There was no language yet for these observations. No talk of months or years, no numbers written in long sequences. Only a deepening sense that the sky's repetition could be used as a gentle structure for life below. Without meeting them, the watcher was walking a path parallel to the scribe and the rope keepers. They all served different needs: trade, land, time, but they were all obeying the same quiet instinct to find order, to record it, and to trust it. On a particularly clear night, when the moon shone nearly full and the stars clustered around it like attending lanterns, the watcher felt a strange peace settle over him. He understood, in his own wordless way, that the world itself preferred patterns, that the sky, the fields, the markets, and the rivers all moved in rhythms. He did not know that his marks on clay, his notches in wood, and his counts of days would someday be recognized as early steps toward what future people would call calendar mathematics. He only knew that no matter what happened in the villages, arguments, sickness, births, and departures, the moon returned. The sky never forgot. And so, in two quiet places, one near a river with clay rooms and ropes across fields, another atop a stone platform beneath the changing moon, the river had always been the silent ruler of the valley. When it rose gently, the people blessed its generosity. When it surged too fiercely, they whispered to calm it. When it shrank into a narrow, hesitant stream, they offered prayers for its return. But the river answered only in motion, never in words. As the seasons passed, the river city had learned to accept this relationship. No one believed they controlled the river, they only hoped to understand it well enough to coexist with its moods. Farmers watched the changing currents. Fishermen learned the subtle shifts in the water's color. Children dipped their hands into the cool flow, noticing how its strength ebbed and swelled throughout the day. But one man watched the river differently. He was older than most, his hair turning the color of river sand, his voice gentle and thoughtful. People called him the Observer, not because he directed or commanded, but because he stood by the riverbank each morning and evening, simply watching. He brought no nets, carried no baskets, and sought no fish. He only watched. Many assumed he was lonely, or perhaps lost in his thoughts. But the Observer carried a purpose quieter than any spoken task. He had begun to notice that the river did not rise and fall at random. The changes came in patterns, not perfect, not precise, but rhythmic in a way that felt alive. At first he thought it was the moon's pull, which the sky watchers studied far away. Then he thought it might be the melting of distant snows in the mountains beyond the horizon. But neither explanation satisfied him entirely. So he watched. Each morning, he placed a wooden pole firmly into the mud at the river's edge. At first, the pole was just a walking stick. But after several visits, he left it there. The next morning, he saw that the waterline had shifted slightly. Sometimes higher, sometimes lower, sometimes by a finger's width, other times by a hand's breadth. He began marking the pole with small cuts. He did not call this measurement. He called it keeping company with the river. Each cut was a quiet conversation. Here is where you were yesterday. Here is where you are today. As days flowed into weeks, he noticed something unusual. The river's rise and fall followed a slow, repeating arc, not perfectly, but close enough that he could almost sense what tomorrow might look like. This small discovery brought him comfort. The river, with all its strength and unpredictability, had a heartbeat. One evening, while carving a new mark into the pole, he was joined by a girl from the nearby houses. She approached softly, curious but respectful. She carried a jar, returning from the well. "Why do you cut the pole each day?" she asked. The observer smiled gently. "To remember what the water tells me." "What does it say?" she asked, lowering her jar to the ground. "That it moves with purpose," he said. "Not always a purpose we understand, but a purpose nonetheless." The child leaned closer. "Does it follow the moon?" "Sometimes," he said thoughtfully. "And sometimes it follows things we cannot see." He explained nothing more, yet his words stayed with her. The next morning, she returned, placing a pebble on the ground beside the pole. "This pebble," she said, "is yesterday. And today is the line above it." The observer nodded slowly. "Yes," he whispered. "You understand." And so, without intending to, the girl began assisting him each morning. She placed pebbles in small lines, sometimes circling them around the pole, sometimes building simple patterns to remember the days. She did not realize she was creating an early chart, a visual memory of variation. As more days passed, other children joined them. They placed reeds to mark wet seasons, shells for drier ones, and scraps of pottery for days when the river rose suddenly. Adults rarely noticed. To them, the children were simply playing by the river. But the children were tracing, day by day, the first gentle whispers of hydrology, measuring a natural cycle and storing it in shared memory. The observer did not boast about this new practice. He simply welcomed it and encouraged it with quiet nods. He understood something deep and soothing. If many eyes watched the river together, the city would learn to predict its moods. One late afternoon, when the sun hung low and warm, the scribe visited the riverbank. He had heard from his assistant about the pebble lines and the pole of days. Curious, he approached the observer. "What do you hope to find?" the scribe asked softly. The observer looked at the rippling water. "Not control," he said. "Only understanding. The river will never obey us. But perhaps, if we listen, we can prepare for its changes." The scribe knelt beside the pole and examined the series of cuts. There were dozens now, rising and falling like the pattern of breath. Pebbles lay arranged in clusters, some tight, some spaced apart, each grouping representing a day, a mood, a memory of the river. "You have created a record," the scribe murmured. The observer shrugged gently. "I have only made marks. The river wrote the rest." The scribe stayed for a long while that evening, watching how the water curled against the pole, feeling how the pattern of cuts mirrored the pattern of clay symbols in the storeroom. The weaver who counted loops of thread. Far from the riverbank, deeper into the city where narrow streets twisted like old vines, there lived a woman whose hands never rested. She was a weaver. Her loom sat in the center of her home, a sturdy wooden frame worn smooth from years of use. Thread stretched across it in long, parallel lines, like thin paths laid from one end of the room to the other. Each morning, she sat before it with calm determination, and each evening she stepped away only when the light grew too dim to distinguish colors. Her cloths were known throughout the city not for their beauty, though they were beautiful, but for their uniformity. Every line was straight, every spacing consistent. Whether she wove a small shawl or a large curtain, the threads aligned with such precision that people wondered how she achieved such balance. The weaver never bragged. She only said, "Threads behave when you listen to them." But listening to thread meant something the city had never truly considered. One day, while preparing a new warp for the loom, she noticed something unusual. A young girl from the neighborhood, one of the same children who played near the river, was watching her closely, eyes fixed on the lines of thread. "How do you make them all the same distance apart?" the girl asked. The weaver smiled faintly. "By feeling. By counting." "Counting," the girl repeated. "Like numbers." "Like loops," the weaver corrected gently. She lifted the frame and tapped the bumps along its side, small notches carved evenly into the wood. Each notch held a thread. Each thread sat the same space from the next. The girl reached out to touch them, her fingers brushing the wood grain. "They all feel the same," she murmured. "Yes," the weaver whispered. "When you make each loop the same size, the cloth becomes steady. If a loop grows too wide, the pattern stretches. If too small, it shrinks." The girl frowned in deep thought. "So, the cloth is like a rope keeper's field." The weaver's smile deepened. "Yes. Patterns must be trusted, or nothing aligns." As the girl watched, the weaver lifted a shuttle and began guiding the horizontal threads through the vertical ones. Her hands moved with slow precision, looping, tightening, repeating. Each motion was identical to the last, forming rows as even as calm water ripples. It was not just weaving. It was iteration, repetition, pattern construction, the foundation on which algebra and sequences would one day stand. The girl sat beside her for many afternoons after that, mesmerized by the gentle, hypnotic rhythm of the loom. She noticed how the weaver counted softly under her breath, not numbers, but beats. One loop for the pull, one loop for the return. Not arithmetic. Not yet. But something very close. She began imitating the motion, using a small piece of string at home to mimic the tightening and releasing of thread. Without knowing it, she was practicing tension control and intuitive understanding of variables long before the word existed. One evening, the scribe visited the weaver. He had come to collect cloth for the temple, but upon entering her home, he paused, struck by the sight of the nearly finished textile. The pattern was simple, lines and waves, but the consistency was astonishing. "You make every length identical," he remarked. The weaver shrugged lightly. "The threads insist on balance. I only give them permission." The scribe traced a finger along the cloth, feeling the regularity of each strand. He recognized something familiar, something that echoed the rows of wedge symbols on his clay tablets. "You are measuring with your hands," he whispered. "I am listening with them," she corrected. The scribe watched her for a long moment as she picked up the shuttle again. Her movements were soft, steady, repetitive, almost meditative. He suddenly understood that the city's knowledge did not rest solely in clay rooms or river poles. Understanding was everywhere. In every craft, in every rhythm, in every quiet practice of ordinary people. The rope keepers measured land. The moon watcher measured time. The observer measured water. The scribe measured grain. And the weaver, she measured harmony. Each of them followed patterns. Each of them relied on repetition. Each of them shaped a world where structure slowly emerged from the tablet that was not about grain. The scribe had spent most of his life writing about things that could be weighed, counted, traded, or stored. Grain, oil, wool, copper, debts and repayments, promises tied to objects, to jars, to sacks, to animals. Every mark on clay seemed to follow a need that someone could point to with a hand. But one day, without planning it, he shaped a different kind of tablet. It began quietly. The day was warm but not harsh, the light soft, the air carrying the faint smell of dust and distant cooking fires. Work in the clay room had slowed, no urgent merchants waited, no priests demanded precise records. His young assistant was cleaning the shelves, dusting the tablets, humming an aimless tune under his breath. On the low table in front of the scribe lay a fresh slab of clay, smooth and unmarked. He picked up his stylus, intending to record a routine delivery of grain. Instead, he paused. On a nearby shelf, he noticed an older tablet, one that had served as a reference for years. It recorded a simple but clear arrangement, rows of marks representing jars of grain, grouped neatly into tens and then into larger bundles. He had used it countless times to remind himself and others how to record certain quantities. He reached for that tablet and set it beside the empty clay. His assistant glanced over. "Are we writing a new delivery?" "Perhaps," the scribe murmured. "Perhaps something else." He began by pressing marks in the familiar way, small symbols for one unit, larger ones for grouped amounts. But this time, he was not thinking of a real shipment. He imagined instead a possible one. What if, he said slowly, still shaping the symbols, someone brought this much grain, and then returned with twice as much? The assistant frowned. "Twice as much? Who would do that?" "No one yet," the scribe replied. "I am only asking the clay to hold the thought." He pressed more marks. On the left side of the new tablet, he recorded a modest quantity, something a farmer might reasonably deliver. On the right, he pressed symbols representing double that amount. Between the two sets of marks, he scratched a small sign, not a word, not a picture, just a line to show the relation. The assistant leaned closer. "So this side is like a shadow of the other." "Yes," the scribe said quietly. "A shadow that is larger, but still itself." He had not invented multiplication. Not yet. But he had allowed the clay to hold a relationship that did not come from an actual transaction. It came from a question. Later that afternoon, when the light had shifted and the room was cooler, he returned to the tablet. He added another line below. This time, he took the smaller amount and recorded what it would look like if it were halved. Fewer marks. A different kind of shadow. The assistant watched with wide eyes. "Who is that for?" he asked. "Is someone coming to claim it?" "No," the scribe answered. "This one is not for anyone in the market." "It is for us." "For us to do what?" the boy asked. "To think," the scribe said. The boy did not fully understand, but the words settled in the air between them, quiet and steady. Over the next few days, the scribe returned to this special tablet again and again. He added new rows to it. One row showed a quantity broken evenly into 3 parts. Another showed how many small units fit into a large one. Another row compared 2 arrangements that used different grouping but ended with the same total. It looked less like a receipt and more like a collection of examples. Soon, the scribe realized what he had done. He had created a tablet not to record the world, but to explore how quantities related to each other, regardless of whether anyone actually moved the jars, sacks, or animals. He had made a tablet about numbers themselves, even though he did not call them that. One evening, he invited the assistant to sit with him beside this new piece. "Tell me," he said, pointing to one of the rows, "which side holds more?" The boy studied the marks. On one side, many small symbols. On the other, fewer large ones. For a moment, he felt confused. His eyes told him one thing, his memory of the symbols' meanings told him another. "They are the same," he said at last, slowly, uncertainly. The scribe nodded gently. "How do you know?" "Because each large mark stands for many of the small ones," the boy replied. "Even if it looks less, it is not less." They went through the rows this way, not hurried, not pressing toward a conclusion. The scribe merely asked. The boy merely answered when he felt sure. Sometimes he was wrong. When he was, the scribe did not scold him, he only showed him more gently, guiding his attention to how groups were formed, how bundles could be broken and reformed. The boy began to see something he had never noticed before. Different arrangements could conceal the same underlying how much. A pile could be scattered or stacked. A line of marks could be regrouped. The shape could change, but the quantity stayed calm beneath the form. At night, as the city drifted into sleep, the scribe placed this special tablet on a separate shelf. Not among the records of temples or merchants, but apart, like a quiet thought kept for later. In time, he began to craft more of these special tablets. Some showed patterns of doubling. Some showed repeated additions of the same quantity. Some asked what remained when you took a portion away. He did not name them. He did not declare that he had created a new discipline. He simply felt that the mind deserved a space to play with quantities without waiting for real-world events to dictate them. Soon, he noticed something else. Working with these imaginary arrangements made his work with real records easier. When a merchant arrived breathless, complaining of a miscount, the scribe's mind had already rehearsed similar patterns. He could see quickly how much was missing, how much was wrongly recorded, where a mistaken grouping had slipped in. It was as if training his mind on pure patterns made it calmer and clearer when facing the noise of daily life. One day, the traveler, the listener, returned to the city after many months away. When he visited the scribe, his eyes fell upon the special shelf with the unusual tablets. "These are different," he observed softly. "Yes," the scribe replied. "These are not about specific events. They are about what happens when amounts meet, when they change form." The traveler lifted one tablet carefully, studying the arrangements of marks. "So you are no longer only preserving what is," he said. "You are exploring what could be." The scribe did not respond immediately. He looked at his own hands, still bearing traces of dried clay. "I suppose I am," he said at last. The traveler smiled with his eyes. "Then you have crossed a quiet threshold," he murmured. "You have begun to separate the idea of quantity from the objects themselves." He set the tablet down gently, as one sets down something fragile but powerful. Outside, nothing dramatic changed. Children still chased each other in the streets. The river still rose and fell. The weaver's loom still whispered its measured rhythm. The moon watcher in a distant land still counted days between phases. But inside that clay room, in the presence of a simple slab of clay not tied to any particular harvest or payment, something subtle had shifted. The school with no name. Word of the scribe's special tablet spread slowly, not through proclamations or formal lessons, but through whispers from those who had glimpsed them. The weaver had come to the clay room once to deliver cloth for the temple and had overheard the assistant speaking excitedly about marks that do not belong to any merchant. The observer at the river had met the scribe one evening and listened as he described patterns that held steady even when the objects changed. Soon, a small group began to gather in the clay room during the quiet hours, after the busiest writing was done, before the lamps were fully extinguished. They were not students in any official sense. They were simply people who had noticed that the world seemed to hum with patterns and wanted to listen more closely. The assistant, of course, was always there, sitting near the table, his hands occasionally fidgeting with a small piece of clay. The weaver came on days when her loom allowed her to finish early. The observer from the river appeared on evenings when the waterline was calm and did not demand his full watch. Sometimes, even a child or two slipped in, drawn by curiosity and the promise of a quiet place to sit. No one called this gathering a school. No one called the scribe a teacher. They simply called it sitting with the tablets. On the table lay not the usual records of trade, but the special tablets the scribe had created, tablets of imagined exchanges, of doubled and halved quantities, of grouped and regrouped symbols. One evening, as the group settled in, the scribe placed a tablet at the center. "This one," he said softly, "shows 3 equal parts becoming one whole." The tablet displayed 3 sets of marks on the left, each set identical. On the right, a single, longer line of marks, carefully grouped. The assistant leaned forward. "So if I have 3 piles that match, I can gather them into one?" he asked. "Yes," the scribe replied. "And if you divide the one back into 3, the piles return to their old shape." The weaver nodded. "Like threads gathered into a rope, then untwisted back into strands," she murmured. The observer smiled faintly. "Or like water stored in 3 jars, then poured into one basin." The scribe listened to their comparisons with a quiet satisfaction. He had not given them definitions. He had not explained rules. He had only shown them a pattern, and their minds had filled it with images from their own lives. Another tablet showed repeated equal additions, a small set of marks copied again and again along the same line. At the end, a single group representing the total. The assistant frowned thoughtfully. "If the small set stands for a day's walk," he said slowly, "and I repeat it 4 times, the last group shows how far I have gone after 4 days." "Yes," the scribe said gently. "You can think of it that way." The weaver tilted her head. "If each set is a row on my loom," she added, "and I repeat it many times, the final cloth has that many rows. Different crafts. Same pattern." No one said repeated addition. No one wrote down a rule. But the idea was there, soft and solid, like a stone in the hand. Soon, the group began to offer their own scenarios. "What if," the observer asked one evening, "the river brings twice as much water in one season as another? Could such a tablet help us imagine what that means before it happens? What if," the weaver asked another time, "I want to weave a cloth twice as wide, but I have threads only measured for 1 width? Could we plan it here, before I touch the loom?" The scribe's answer was always the same: "Let us see." They would shape new tablets, pressing marks slowly, talking quietly about what each group stood for. Sometimes they erased their attempts and began again. The clay was patient, it accepted their revisions calmly. One evening, a child from the marketplace slipped in and watched from the doorway. The lamplight flickered across the faces of the small group as they leaned over a tablet showing a broken quantity, a hole that had been cut unevenly. The child finally spoke. "Is that one fair?" he asked, pointing hesitantly at the uneven groups. The room turned toward him. "No," the weaver answered gently. "That one would cause an argument." The scribe nodded. "So the pattern warns us." It tells us that we must be careful when dividing. They smoothed the clay, then pressed new marks, this time ensuring the parts matched more closely. Better, the child whispered. He did not know the word equality. He only felt its absence and its arrival. Slowly, over many evenings, the room became a place where people tried out ideas before applying them to the world. If the pattern made sense in clay, if it felt calm, consistent, and fair, it was more likely to bring peace when used with grain, with land, with cloth, with water. Without naming it, they had built a fragile, early version of proof, checking a thought in a quiet, controlled form before trusting it in noisy reality. The scribe noticed this, but he did not boast. He was simply grateful that the clay could carry such delicate weight. Sometimes, the traveler, when passing through the city, would join them. He would listen to their discussions, lift a tablet, and say, "In another land, I have seen something like this, though they arrange their marks differently. Yet the relation is the same." Each time he said this, the room grew a little more aware that what they were doing belonged to no one alone. The patterns they explored did not belong to their river, their city, their temple. They belonged to the world itself. One night, as the lamp burned low and the group prepared to leave, the assistant lingered behind. "Master," he said softly, "what do we call this?" The scribe tilted his head. "Call what?" "This," the boy gestured around the room. "These tablets that are not about grain or cloth. These questions." Sitting together and thinking. The scribe considered. He looked at the clay. He looked at the people who came, some regularly, some only when life allowed. He thought of the rope keepers, the moon watcher, the weaver, the observer, the traveler. He thought of the patterns that were slowly becoming easier to see, like a faint drawing becoming clearer with each stroke. "I do not think we need a name yet," he said at last. "Sometimes things grow stronger before we name them." The boy frowned slightly. "But if it had a name, we could call others to it." The scribe smiled softly. "They are already coming," he said. "Those who feel drawn to patterns always find their way here. The name will come when it must." The boy accepted this answer, though it left an unfinished feeling in his chest. Still, as he lay down to sleep later that night, he realized something important. He no longer saw numbers only in jars or sacks. He saw them in steps between houses, in loops of thread on the weaver's cloth, in the distance from one river mark to the next, in the days between full moons. The world, once a blur of separate events, now felt gently connected by invisible lines, a lattice of relations that he could almost touch. In the darkness, as he drifted toward sleep, he imagined those lines stretching across lands he had never seen, from his city's clay room to distant temples, to other riverbanks, to mountains and deserts and quiet villages where people were also, in their own ways, measuring, grouping, comparing. He did not know that scholars far in the future would call this subject mathematics, dividing it into branches and naming its methods. He knew only that, here and now, in this humble room, people were learning to think with shapes and quantities, to test fairness and balance before putting them into the world. The school with no name went on meeting, night after night, unknown, the pattern hidden in the market noise. The city's market was never fully quiet. Even on the gentlest mornings, even when the winds were soft and the clouds shaded the sun, the market sound hovered like a warm haze over the streets. Voices rose and fell. Clay jars clinked. Woven baskets rustled. Steps scuffed against packed earth. It was not chaos, exactly, more like a restless murmuring of the city's daily rhythm. To the people who lived there, the noise meant nothing unusual. It was simply the sound of life unfolding. But to the scribe, who now saw patterns where once he saw only activity, the market had begun to reveal a different kind of music. One morning, he stood beneath the shadow of a fig tree near the market's edge, observing the movement before stepping into its flow. He watched how merchants lifted their scales in the same habitual way. How buyers inspected baskets of grain with rhythmic taps of their fingertips. How cloth sellers folded fabrics with predictable motions, twice longwise, then once across, every time identical. He noticed lines forming at certain stalls but not others. He noticed that buyers always seemed to drift toward a particular pottery stand at mid-morning, never earlier, never later. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds blend. What once had been a jumble now felt like repetition. Soft, subtle repetition. He began walking slowly through the market, not yet carrying his writing board. The stone path underneath held the warmth of early sunlight. He passed a man arranging clay pots into a neat line, tallest at the back, smallest in front. Further along, he saw baskets of figs arranged into circular piles, each pile nearly the same diameter. The scribe paused beside a date vendor whose fruits were arranged into perfectly shaped clusters, for small piles at the front, two larger ones behind. He had seen her do this many times, but today he watched more carefully. "Why do you group them so?" he asked gently. She shrugged lightly, wiping her hands on her cloth. "People like to see choice," she said. "Small piles for small coin, larger piles for larger coin. It feels honest." The scribe studied the piles again. Each cluster was not perfectly identical, but close enough to convey fairness. Close enough to calm the buyer's suspicion that a trick might be hidden beneath the fruit. "Do the piles ever change size?" he asked. "Only when I run low," the woman said. "But then I make them smaller altogether. So the small stays small, the large stays large. If I mix them, people complain." He nodded. Fairness again. Balance. Matching forms. The marketplace, he realized, had become a quiet arena where patterns held the city together, even when no one spoke about them. He observed more closely. A cloth seller measured length not with a rope but by stretching the fabric from fingertip to elbow, his own arm acting as a natural unit. A fisherman counted his catch into rows of 5, because 5 fit comfortably into the basket's width. A woodworker bound bundles of sticks with identical loops of rope, each loop pulled tight in the same steady manner. Every craft had found its own pattern for dealing with amount, space, or fairness. Later, in the afternoon, the assistant joined the scribe in the market. His eyes were less experienced, but he was beginning to see fragments of what the scribe saw. "Why do you stop so much today?" the boy asked. "Because the market is speaking," the scribe said softly. The boy frowned. "Speaking?" "Yes," the scribe whispered. "In patterns. In the way baskets fill and empty. In the way people line up. In the way prices rise and fall." They stopped near a merchant who sold grain. The merchant used a small clay measure, a simple cup, to scoop grain from a large sack into smaller jars. The cup emptied the sack at a predictable pace: scoop, pour, shake, scoop again. The assistant watched the rhythm, and suddenly he murmured, "If he fills 4 jars, the sack lowers this much." He gestured with his hand, marking a small drop. "And if he fills 8 jars?" the scribe asked. "The sack would lower twice as much," the boy said, not hesitating. The scribe nodded slowly. "You did not measure the sack. You measured the pattern." The boy felt a warmth spread in his chest. He had arrived at the answer not by counting the grains, not by touching the sack, but by feeling the repetition in the movement. The scribe placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is the beginning of general thinking," he said softly. "You no longer need the exact numbers to understand the relation." They walked deeper into the market. Near the potter's corner, a young apprentice was setting out newly fired bowls. He arranged them in rows, 4 on one side, 4 on the other, with a small gap in the middle. When someone purchased 2 bowls, he did not shift the remaining bowls to fill the gap. Instead, he moved the entire row forward so the rows remained balanced. The assistant tilted his head. Why doesn't he just push the bowls together? Because balance matters, the scribe murmured. Even in objects that cannot speak. The weaver passed through the market at that moment, carrying a folded piece of cloth to deliver. When she saw the scribe observing the bowls, she joined them. "That boy," she whispered, "likes to see symmetry. It calms him." "Symmetry?" the assistant asked. "A shape that balances itself," she explained. "2 sides matching. Or nearly matching. It feels orderly." Her words struck the scribe gently, like a pebble dropped into still water. Symmetry. Balance. Fairness. Pattern. Repetition. None of these concepts had names in their language, not in the way scholars would someday use them, but every merchant, every craftsman, every child understood their presence without needing the words. The scribe closed his eyes. The market noise, the calls, the footsteps, the haggling, faded into a softer hum. He imagined each pattern as a thread. Some threads tied to fairness. Some to comparison. Some to repetition. Some to balance. And all those threads, whether in the loom of the weaver or the river's breath or the moon's turning, were part of a single fabric. A vast fabric that no one had woven on purpose, yet everyone contributed to. He opened his eyes. "We must bring these thoughts to the clay room tonight," he said quietly. The assistant nodded immediately. The weaver smiled. That night, when the small group gathered, no longer only observers, but gentle seekers of structure, the scribe placed a new tablet on the table. "This one," he said, "is not about grain or rope or moons. It is about the way the market moves." They leaned in. He pressed for marks. Then another 4 beneath them. Then a small symbol connecting the rows. 2 rows, the assistant whispered. "Matching." The scribe smiled. "Symmetry." He pressed another pattern, a long line of marks that grew shorter in the next row, then shorter still. "Things lessen," the observer murmured. But the pattern remained steady. "Decay," the traveler added quietly, though they did not know the word. He pressed one more arrangement, a group repeated 3 times, then doubled, then halved. "Replication," the weaver breathed. The quiet line that stretched into the future. The clay room had become, over many weeks, a sanctuary of patient thought. Lamps glowed softly against the walls. Shadows drifted gently over the tablets. People arrived at different hours, sometimes early, sometimes late, but always entering with the same calm reverence. Yet on one particular evening, something subtle, but important, changed. The scribe placed a fresh tablet on the table, larger than most. Its surface was smooth and cool. He took his time with it, running his hand across the clay as if sensing its readiness. The group gathered, the assistant, the weaver, the observer, 2 curious children, and even a merchant who had grown interested in these unusual gatherings. "You brought a larger one tonight," the weaver noted. "Yes," the scribe replied. "Because today we try something that does not yet live in our daily world." The room fell silent. With slow, deliberate motion, the scribe pressed a line of marks, small ones, across the top of the tablet. Then beneath them, he pressed a shorter line. Then beneath that, a shorter one still. "It shrinks," the assistant whispered. "Like when the river's flow lessens." The scribe nodded. "Yes. But now watch." He pressed another row, a line of marks slightly longer than the first. Then beneath it, another even longer. The assistant inhaled sharply. "It grows," he said quietly. "Yes," the scribe replied. "And now watch again." He smoothed a section of the clay and pressed a new row. This time, the marks were evenly spaced, marching across the tablet like footsteps. Beneath them, another row stretched further, each mark aligned but extending slightly beyond the previous row's end. The assistant frowned. "This one does not return to the same size." "No," the scribe said gently. "It continues. It extends." He pressed another row beneath it, longer still. The observer leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You mean to show change that continues without a repeat?" "Yes," the scribe whispered. "A progression. Not a cycle. Not a repetition. A movement that continues, step after step." Silence settled like dust. They had seen cycles everywhere: moons, seasons, river floods. They had seen repetition, loom threads, rope loops, market piles. But they had rarely considered something that grew in one direction continuously, without circling back. The weaver broke the silence. "Like a child growing taller," she murmured. "The height does not return to a smaller form." The children exchanged glances. One of them whispered, "Like counting steps to a far place. Every step takes you further, not back." The scribe nodded. "This tablet," he said softly, "is the first of its kind. It is not about fairness or division or doubling. It is about the idea that quantities can march forward endlessly, always becoming something new." He pressed a small mark at the far end of the longest row. The assistant leaned closer. "What does that mark mean?" The scribe looked at him with a calm, almost tender expression. "It means beyond." The assistant felt his breath catch. "Beyond what we can mark today," the scribe continued. "Beyond what we can count with the jars or sacks we know. Beyond what we can imagine fully. Yet still part of the same line." The observer whispered, "A river that never circles back." The weaver added, "A thread that never loops." One of the children murmured, "A path that never ends." The scribe smiled gently. "Yes. A line that stretches into the future." They studied it for a long time. Not because it was complex, but because it opened a doorway in their minds. For the first time, they were looking at something not tied to the cycles of nature. Something not tied to the limits of the marketplace. Something not tied to a fixed store of goods. Something not even tied to human experience. They were looking at infinite possibility, unbounded growth, unbounded continuation. Of course, they did not call it infinity. They did not know the word. But they felt its presence like a cool breeze through an open doorway. The scribe smoothed the clay along the bottom edge, clearing space. Then, pressing each symbol very slowly, he created a sequence: one mark, then two, then three, then four, then five, each group slightly larger, stretching across the clay like a road. He stopped only when he reached the edge. "The clay ends," the assistant noted softly. "But the idea does not," the scribe replied. A silence deeper than any they had shared settled over the room. The traveler arrived late that night, stepping quietly into the clay room. When he saw the tablet, he froze. "You have crossed into a new land," he whispered. "One that many cultures reach only after lifetimes." The scribe looked at the long sequence. "I only followed the thought where it led." The traveler shook his head gently. "No. You extended the world." The lamp flickered. Outside, the city slept. Children dreamed. The river flowed. The moon drifted in its patient arc. And inside this humble clay room, humanity stepped, quietly, without fanfare, into the concept of the infinite. Not in words. Not in symbols. Not in formal proof. But in feeling. The feeling that numbers were not confined to jars or fields or moons, but could stretch forward endlessly, just as time itself does. The group lingered late into the night, some in awe, some in thoughtful silence, some simply sensing that the world had become slightly larger. When they finally left, the tablet remained on the table, its long line of marks, the map that never left the room. The clay room had grown used to unusual tablets. At first, it had been a place only for grain and jars, for oil and wool, for the simple, heavy facts of daily life. Then came the special tablets that were not about grain, that played gently with imagined amounts. After that came the quiet line that stretched to beyond, pressing the idea of unending growth into the soft surface. Now, another question began to move slowly through the scribe's thoughts. It started with something simple, walking. He had always walked the same routes through the city. From his home to the clay room. From the clay room to the market. From the market to the river. And sometimes, in the evenings, along the outer paths where the houses thinned and the fields began. He noticed, without truly deciding to, that these paths crossed each other in familiar ways. There was a certain point where, if he turned left, he would reach the weaver's house, and if he turned right, he would find the potter's kiln. There was a corner where the smell of bread always lingered, and another where the sound of the river grew louder. One evening, after a long day, he sat alone with a new, wide tablet and felt a faint curiosity. Could all of this movement, all of these turns and crossings, be drawn, not as art, not as decoration, but as relation? He did not want to draw houses as they looked. He did not care about doors, windows, or the way roofs sloped. What interested him was simpler, and in some ways deeper, which places lay nearer, which lay farther, which paths crossed, which paths did not. So, with slow care, he pressed a small mark near the center of the clay. This, he whispered to himself, is the clay room. He pressed another mark above it, a little distance away. This is the market. He pressed a third mark nearer the bottom, slightly to the side. And this is the river. He connected the marks with faint, straight lines. Not to show walls or roads exactly, but to show the way the paths lay in his memory, how one always came after another, how they met and parted. He did not know that future people would call this geometry, mapping, topology. He only knew that he was trying to show how things sat with respect to each other. When his assistant entered and saw the tablet, his eyes lit up. "That is the market," the boy said immediately, pointing at the upper mark. "How do you know?" the scribe asked. "Because it is above," the boy answered, as if it were obvious. "You always walk up the street to go there." The scribe smiled faintly. "And the river?" "Below," the boy said. "Because we walked down to it." So their bodies already felt what the clay now showed, a simple arrangement of places in a mental space. Day by day, the tablet grew. They added the weaver's house, the potter's kiln, the rope-keeper's fields beyond the city, the gate where travelers entered, the storage houses where surplus grain was kept. Each new mark was placed not according to strict measurement, but according to remembered distance, nearer, farther, beyond. One afternoon, the observer from the river came to the clay room. He studied the tablet for a long time, tracing the lines gently. "If I start here," he said, pointing to the river mark, "and I walk this way," his finger slid along one of the lines, "I reach the market." "Yes," the assistant said. "But if you go this way instead, you reach the potter first, then the market." The observer nodded slowly. "So the clay shows what the feet already know." The weaver visited, too. She stared at the tablet with the eyes of someone who understood patterns in thread. "It is like a cloth," she murmured. "Each place is a knot, and each path a thread between knots." The scribe liked that image. He began to press the lines with more care, connecting each place not randomly but with an awareness that the connections created a structure of their own. A web of possible movements, a quiet network of relationships. This tablet never left the room. No official asked for it. No priest ordered its creation. It was not used to settle disputes or count taxes. It simply sat there, growing more detailed over time, visited by those who found something soothing in its order. Sometimes the children came just to trace paths with their fingers. "If I wanted to visit everyone in one day," one child said, "what path would be shortest?" The assistant laughed softly. "Shortest for your legs or for your patience?" The child thought very hard, then pointed at the clay. "This one," he decided, tracing a loop that passed through many marks and returned to the clay room at the end. The scribe said nothing, but he felt quietly impressed. The child had asked a question the world would later struggle with for centuries, in a web of many places: what is the best way through? The clay did not answer fully. It only allowed the question to live. Over time, they added more than just places. The scribe pressed small signs along the paths, marks that hinted at difficulty. A steep section. A crowded alley. A smooth, wide road. The lines began to hold not only distance, but quality. "That path is shorter," the observer said one evening, "but rougher. This one is longer, but easier." The clay tells us both. The traveler, when he returned again, stared at the map-like tablet in calm wonder. In another land, he said quietly, "I have seen drawings of rivers, drawn like snakes curling across bark. But I have not seen something like this, a picture not of what things look like, but of how they are connected." The scribe nodded. "This does not show our city as the birds see it," he said. "It shows it as our feet feel it." The traveler smiled. "Then it is a map of experience." The map never became a tool for soldiers or rulers. It never guided a caravan. It remained a gentle experiment, a way for a few people to see their world arranged in thought rather than in stone and dust. But in that, the whisper between generations. Time in the city did what time always does: it moved forward, quietly and without asking permission. Children grew taller. Some of them became rope keepers. Some became merchants. Some left the city entirely, walking along paths that did not appear on any clay tablet. Some stayed and took up their parents' crafts. New children were born, and they looked at the world with fresh, untroubled eyes, not knowing how much their elders had struggled to shape a little order out of the river's moods, the sky's rhythm, and the demands of daily life. The scribe's hair grew thinner and whiter. His hands, once steady and strong, began to carry a faint tremble. He still wrote, still pressed marks into clay, but more slowly now. He relied more often on his assistant, whose own hands had grown skilled and sure. The assistant, no longer fully a boy but not yet old, found himself doing something that surprised him, repeating the scribe's phrases to the next generation. On certain evenings, when work was light and the lamps flickered gently, he would sit at the low table with 2 or 3 curious children. The scribe would watch from his seat, listening, correcting only when truly necessary. "This mark," the assistant would say, "shows 1 measure. 1 jar of oil. 1 bundle of cloth. 1 sack of grain." He pressed the symbol carefully. "And this," he continued, "shows many of those. A bundle. A group." He pressed the larger symbol. The children followed with wide eyes. He did not rush them. He remembered how long it had taken him to feel the difference between a pile and a pattern, between seeing and understanding. So he gave them time. He let silence hang between questions and answers, trusting that their minds were quietly arranging things. "Why does this tablet have no names?" one child asked, pointing to one of the special tablets, the kind that showed only relationships, only imagined quantities. "Because it is not about a real delivery," the assistant said. "It is about what would happen if a thing were doubled, halved, or shared." The child frowned. "So it is a story made of amounts." The assistant smiled. "Yes. A story that clay can tell without using words." The scribe watched this with a strange mixture of tenderness and distance. He had once been the one doing the explaining. Now he sat slightly apart, hearing his approach echoed in another's voice, softened and reshaped by another mind. In the far fields, a new group of rope keepers began their work. Some of them had learned from their fathers how to knot the measuring ropes and stretch them across the earth. Others had watched and imitated. A few had heard, in quiet conversations, that somewhere in the city, people were doing with clay what they did with rope, trying to capture fairness in form. By the river, new children laid their own pebbles at the foot of the measurement pole, no longer guided by the original observer, who had grown too tired to visit every day. Yet his habit persisted. The pole still stood. The cuts in the wood still spoke. The pebbles kept arriving. On the stone platform in the distant land, another sky watcher had replaced the first. The new watcher inherited not only the role, but the carefully marked boards that recorded the moon's changes. He added his own marks next to the old ones, marveling at how long the pattern had held. "Those who came before me saw the same cycles," he whispered one night, touching a mark made by a hand long gone. "And those who come after me will see them still." In the city, the weaver's apprentice, once the small girl who had touched the loom's notches with reverent curiosity, and now sat at the loom herself, measuring tension with practiced fingers. She counted loops the way the scribe counted marks, the way the rope keepers counted knots, the way the sky watcher counted moons. She sometimes visited the clay room when her hands were sore and her eyes tired from colors. There, she would sit quietly, tracing the special tablets, feeling in them the same calm that weaving long rows of cloth brought her. The traveler continued to come and go. Each time he returned, he carried new stories of traders who used stones lined in rows to track their goods, of shepherds who had begun using carved sticks to remember flock sizes, of builders who experimented with repeating shapes to form strong walls. Every time he spoke, the scribe and his circle felt the same quiet awe. They were not alone. The questions they asked in this small room were being asked, in different forms, in countless other places. One evening, when the light was particularly soft and the air unusually still, the traveler, the scribe, the assistant, the weaver, the observer, and two children all found themselves gathered together. It was a rare moment. The table held several tablets, some old and worn, their edges softened by years of handling, some new and sharp, their marks crisp and clear. The traveler placed his hand over them lightly. "These," he said, "may one day crumble. Clay breaks. Wood rots. Rope frays. Even memory fades." The children looked troubled. "Then will all this be lost?" one asked quietly. The scribe answered, his voice firm despite his age. "Not all," he said. "Because once a pattern is truly seen, it is hard to unsee. These tablets helped us notice what was there all along. The moons will still turn," the observer added. "The river will still rise and fall. The cloth will still need even loops," the weaver said. "The paths will still cross in the same ways," the assistant added, thinking of the map. The traveler nodded slowly. "And somewhere, someone will look at these things again and feel what we felt," he said. They might not know our names. They might never see these exact tablets. But they will recognize the patterns. They will give them their own marks, their own words. He smiled faintly. Perhaps they will even give the whole thing a name. The children thought about that, a name for all of this, the numbers, the patterns, the maps, the quietly counted moons, the fair divisions, the endless lines. They did not know that in some far future tongue, that name would be mathematics. For now, they only knew the feeling it gave them, a kind of gentle clarity, as if the world, with all its confusion and change, had a soft skeleton of order inside it. A whisper between generations. The whisper said, "Look closely. Things repeat. Things balance. Things grow. Things relate. You are not lost in chaos. You are walking through patterns." Years later, long after the first scribe's hands had gone still, long after the first rope keepers had laid down their measuring ropes, long after the first moon watcher had left his platform, their work lived on, not as sacred relics, but as habits, as instincts, as quiet expectations of order. Children grew up assuming that amounts could be written, that land could be measured, that time could be counted, that fairness could be tested, that maps could represent space, that lines could stretch beyond what eyes could see. They did not feel these practices as inventions. They felt them as the normal way of existing in the world. That is how the quiet birth of mathematics truly completed its earliest chapter, not in a single great discovery, but in the slow shift from strangeness to obviousness. What had once been experiments in clay, rope, sky, and thread became the background rhythm of thought, a whisper that moved from one generation to the next, changing shape but never entirely fading. And so, in a city by a river, under a sky traced by stars and moons, among people who wanted only to live a little more peacefully with one another and with the world, mathematics continued to grow. Not loudly, not suddenly, but gently. Like a breath, the stone that remembered more than it showed. Long after the first gatherings in the clay room had become a quiet tradition, a curious event unfolded, small at first, almost invisible, but destined to shift the city's understanding of patterns in a new direction. It began with a stone. Not a special stone. Not one carved or polished. Not one chosen by a priest or blessed by ceremony. It was simply a flat stone found near the riverbank, worn smooth by years of water pressing gently against it. A boy found it while playing with other children. He skipped it across the river, but it landed near the edge instead of sinking. Its shape caught his eye, rounded edges, flat center, soft to the touch. He picked it up and brought it to the clay room, knowing that the scribe sometimes collected curious objects. "What do you see in this?" the assistant asked, amused. The boy shrugged. "It feels calm," he said. The scribe took the stone, running his fingers across it. He set it on the table, beside the tablets. Days passed before it meant anything more. One afternoon, while the scribe and assistant were working on a simple record for a merchant, the assistant reached for the stone absent-mindedly. As he tapped it on the table, he noticed something peculiar. When it rested beside the tablet, its length nearly matched one of the rows of marks. Its width nearly matched a smaller row on another tablet. He frowned. "Master," he said slowly, "look at this." He placed the stone against the tablet. The length aligned almost perfectly with a row of 10 marks. The scribe raised an eyebrow. "Strange," he murmured. The assistant turned the stone, placing it across another part of the tablet, this time aligning it with a row of 5 marks. Again, the fit was nearly perfect. "It matches many lengths," the assistant whispered. "Different ones. Yet it has not changed." The scribe took the stone in his hands, weighing it. "Important things," he said softly, "often stay the same even when the things around them change." He set the stone down and looked at the tablet again. Then a thought passed through him, gentle, like a breeze shifting direction. What if this, he said, gesturing to the stone, could be used to compare many different things? Even things that cannot be placed side by side. The assistant blinked. Like what? Like distances in the city, the scribe said. Or the widths of cloth. Or the size of a field. Anything that repeats. He pressed the stone against the table, imagining how it might mark a repeated length on different materials, clay, wood, rope. It could become a unit. Not a unit with a name. Not a law. Just a quiet reference, a shape that remembered a length the way the moon watcher remembered days between phases. The weaver, when she visited later, immediately saw its value. If I tied a thread around it, she said, I could measure a cloth's width without using my hands. The hands grow tired. The stone does not. The rope keepers heard of the stone shortly after. One of them held it in his palm and smiled. A length that the river cannot wash away, he said. We could use it to check our ropes each year. The stone began to travel. Not far, just between the hands of those in the clay room, the weaver's home, the fields, and the market. Each person found new meaning in its steadiness. It was not the first tool of measurement ever created, but it became one of the first shared references, a common whisper across different crafts. The assistant noticed something else. Master, he said, what if we place marks on the stone itself? The scribe looked startled, then intrigued. He took a stylus and pressed small, shallow scratches along the edge of the stone, dividing it into equal parts, just as the sky watcher divided months into moons. When he finished, the stone carried a quiet precision. Now, the scribe said, it does not only remember a length, it remembers many. This idea spread faster than expected. Potters began using marked stones to check the width of their bowls. Builders used them to keep bricks aligned. Even cooks began measuring flour by laying the stone across their mixing boards. It was not long before someone asked a question the city had never asked before. If this stone holds one length, what holds smaller ones? It was a child, again, a child, who asked first. The assistant smiled. Let us find out. They took a piece of clay and shaped a thin, narrow strip. They dried it in the sun until it hardened. Then they marked it, using the stone as a reference, dividing the strip into smaller parts. A new whisper entered the world. If the stone held a long length, and the strip held a smaller one, then a single idea connected them. Parts of a whole. Divisions of one measure. Fractions, though no one knew the word. Soon, the clay room was filled with new experiments. Not grand ones. Not formal ones. Just people turning the stone, measuring cloth, aligning ropes, comparing distances. They held the strip and the stone side by side, feeling the quiet truth that the world could be understood not only through full amounts, but through parts. This is half the stone, the assistant murmured. This is a third, the observer said. This is twice as long, the weaver added. They spoke in everyday language, not realizing they were touching concepts that future scholars would name ratios, proportions, units, scales. To them, it was simply a new way to make peace with the world shapes. One evening, when the traveler returned, the scribe placed the stone in his hand. The traveler turned it slowly, examining the scratched marks along its side. You have created a measure, he whispered. Something that others can copy. Something that lives independent of the clay and the rope. The scribe shook his head. We did not create anything, he said. We only listened to what the world offered us. The traveler smiled. That is how all things worth keeping are found. And so the stone remained, the silence before a new kind of thought. The city was changing, but gently, like dawn rising without startling the night. People now spoke casually about how much, how wide, how far, how long, without realizing that these words once belonged only to merchants and rope keepers. Children arranged pebbles in groups during games. Weavers measured their cloth not only with fingertips but with strips of baked clay. Rope keepers checked their knots against lengths that others had verified. Patterns were no longer curiosities. They were expectations. Still, something deeper was quietly preparing to emerge. It began with a strange unease that the assistant felt while examining the special tablets. He could read them easily now, doubling, halving, grouping, ungrouping. His hands moved confidently over the clay. His thoughts arranged themselves naturally into the rhythms the scribe had taught him. But one tablet troubled him. It was the tablet of the endless line, the one that showed numbers continuing beyond the clay. He traced the line again and again, feeling the pull toward its edge. The clay ends, he whispered. But the idea does not. He remembered saying those words long ago, but now they felt heavier, fuller. If ideas did not end with clay, then where did they end? He didn't know. This question stayed with him for days. One evening, when the clay room was quiet and the scribe was too tired to speak much, the assistant sat alone with the endless line tablet. He smoothed a new slab of clay and began pressing marks, a single line again, stretching from left to right. But this time, when he reached the edge, he did not stop. He pressed an arrow. A simple shape, made of two lines meeting at a point. He pulled back and stared at it. The arrow pointed beyond the clay, suggesting continuation in a way the row of marks alone never had. He felt a shiver. The scribe, half asleep in his chair, opened his eyes. "What is that?" he asked quietly. "An idea," the assistant whispered. The scribe struggled to sit up. He looked at the arrow for a long time. "It says j and then, and then, and then," the assistant said. "It says the line does not stop." The scribe nodded slowly. Yes, it does." The assistant hesitated. Then he pressed a second arrow, this one at the opposite end of the line. Two arrows. One pointing left. One pointing right. The line now stretched in both directions, without beginning or end. The scribe closed his eyes. "You have made something new," he whispered. "Not a number. Not a record. Not a measure. A thought that floats free from the world." The assistant did not fully understand, but he felt the truth in the scribe's tone. An arrow on clay was a small thing. But what it represented was enormous. It represented something the city had not yet conceived. Systems of thought that exist without physical anchors. Lines that exist even when nothing is being counted. Concepts that stand by themselves, complete and independent. He felt dizzy, as though standing on the edge of a cliff, looking not at a drop but at a horizon. When the others arrived, the weaver, the observer, the children, and eventually even the traveler, the assistant showed them the tablet. The weaver leaned in first. "It has no start," she murmured. "No end. Like a thread unbroken." The observer whispered, "Like the river before it meets any bank." The children looked confused. "Where are the marks to count?" one asked. "You do not count these," the assistant said softly. "You follow them." The traveler approached last. He touched the arrow gently. "This," he said quietly, "is the beginning of a new kind of seeing. Not just the world as it is, but as it could be if freed from the limits of clay and rope." He paused. "This is thought, turning into structure." The scribe looked at the assistant with eyes full of tired pride. "It is your time now." The last tablet the scribe ever touched. The season had turned. The days grew shorter, the river slower, and the breeze that once warmed the clay room now slipped in with a cool, almost tender bite. It was not a harsh cold, just a gentle reminder that time continued to move, even when the people inside the clay room wished it would pause for a single quiet moment. The scribe had grown frail. His steps, once firm and deliberate, had softened into shuffles that barely stirred the dust on the floor. His voice, once calm and steady, now carried the trembling softness of someone whose breath had begun to weigh more heavily on his chest. But his eyes still carried the old brightness, the spark of quiet curiosity that had begun this entire journey. The assistant, now a young man with steady hands and a clearer voice, guided him gently to his seat by the low table. The scribe insisted on coming to the clay room every day, even if only to sit in its familiar silence. The silence held him the way an old friend holds a hand. On this evening, the assistant placed a fresh slab of clay on the table. Not because the scribe needed to write, but because the presence of clay always calmed him. The scribe touched its surface with fingertips that had shaped thousands of marks in his lifetime. The clay was cool, receptive, so familiar it felt like touching memory itself. The assistant stood ready with a stylus, but the scribe shook his head faintly. "No," he whispered. "Tonight, you write." The assistant paused. "Master, what should I write?" The scribe took a long, slow breath. "Not a record," he said. "Not a number. Not a pattern we have seen before." He lifted his trembling hand and pointed to the tablet of the endless line, the one with arrows stretching in both directions. "Tonight," he said, voice no louder than falling dust, "we write what we do not yet understand." The assistant felt his heart tighten. The group began to gather, sensing something unusual in the air. The weaver came in quietly, her hand still dusted with thread fibers. The observer arrived, smelling faintly of river mist. Two children slipped in, wordless but attentive. And finally, the traveler, unexpectedly in the city again, entered with soft steps, as though summoned by fate or instinct. The room settled into a warm hush. The scribe nodded to his assistant. "Begin." The assistant pressed the first mark into the clay. It was not a number. It was not a shape. It was simply a point, a single, quiet point. Then he pressed another point, some distance away. 2 points, separated by space. The scribe's faint smile returned. "Between any 2 points," he whispered, "there is always a way to travel." The assistant connected them with a line, straight, careful, deliberate. He waited for instruction. But none came. Instead, the scribe looked at the traveler. The traveler stepped forward and gently pressed a new point onto the clay, above the line, forming a simple triangle when connected. The weaver approached next. She pressed a point below, creating another shape, a shape that didn't resemble anything specific, yet felt intuitively familiar. Then the observer added his point to the left. The children, shy but excited, pressed theirs to the right. The assistant connected the points slowly, line by line, never forcing structure, only revealing it. What emerged was not a map. Not an object. Not a symbol anyone recognized. It was simply connection. Points linked by thought. Relationships born without purpose. Patterns formed without necessity. The scribe watched with eyes shining faintly. "You see," he whispered, "the world is not only what is, but what could be. What could connect. What could align." The assistant swallowed. "Master, is this mathematics?" The scribe breathed softly, slowly. "This," he said, is the beginning of thinking in forms. Thinking in structures that do not need clay, rope, sky, or river to exist. The traveler bowed his head. Abstract thought. The scribe nodded gently. In time, he continued, artists will imagine shapes no hand can carve. Builders will dream of structures not yet possible. Thinkers will follow lines that exist only in their minds. He placed his trembling hand on the new tablet. We begin it here, quietly. The assistant pressed one final point, a tiny mark, near the edge. What is that? The weaver asked. The assistant smiled softly, a quiet echo of the scribe's oldest wisdom. It is the place we have not yet reached. The room grew still. The scribe leaned back. The lamplight flickered when understanding became a seed. Time moved gently past the day the scribe's seat became empty. The clay room did not close. The gatherings did not end. The patterns did not stop emerging. Instead, something soft but steady happened. The people who had once listened to the scribe now found themselves speaking in his place. Not as teachers, not formally, but as carriers of a quiet torch. The assistant was the first to feel it. For weeks, he resisted the pull of leadership. He continued shaping clay and arranging tablets, but he avoided the central seat. He walked through the market with lowered eyes. He visited the river without speaking. He returned to the loom room, the fields, the temple, seeking comfort in familiar crafts. But everywhere he went, people asked small questions that tugged at him. Is this division fair? Does this path connect more easily than the other? How can I measure this cloth without stretching it? How many days until the moon returns to this shape? And slowly, almost reluctantly, he began answering. Not with the authority of a master. Not with the certainty of someone seeking praise. But with the calm simplicity he had learned from the scribe. Let us see. Let us test. Let the clay show us. Let the pattern decide. He began inviting people to the clay room again, not only the weaver, the observer, the children, the traveler, but newcomers too, young builders, curious merchants, guards resting between shifts, mothers weaving baskets, shepherds passing through with their flocks. The clay room became something new. Not only a place of memory, not only a place of thought, but a place of shared understanding. One evening, months after the scribe's passing, the assistant placed all the special tablets onto the central table. The tablet of doubling. The tablet of fair division. The endless line with arrows. The abstract network of points pressed in the last gathering. The room filled with people, far more than ever before. Some stood at the doorway, unable to fit inside. Others sat on the floor, leaning close to see. The assistant looked around, nervous. His voice shook at first, but steadied as he spoke. These tablets do not belong to us alone, he said. They are the beginning of something that will grow beyond our city, beyond our lifetimes. The traveler nodded. Patterns travel, he said. Even when people do not. The weaver placed her hand on the tablet of fair division. We all understood this long before we knew its name, she whispered. The observer touched the tablet of the endless line. And this is the shape of what we cannot see, but can feel. A child, one who had joined the clay room only recently, pointed to the tablet of points and lines. What is this? He asked. The assistant knelt beside him. This, he said softly, is a seed. The child frowned. A seed? Yes, the assistant said. A seed of something that has not grown yet. One day, people will understand these shapes better than we can. They will name them. They will find ways to use them in building, in planning, in imagining. The traveler added, "Some will use them to understand the stars. Some to build bridges. Some to count the uncountable." The assistant nodded. "And all of it," he whispered, "began here. With simple marks. With watching the river. With tracing the moon. With measuring rope. With weaving thread. With noticing patterns that whispered to us." The room quieted. The assistant took a fresh slab of clay. He pressed a single point into the center. "This," he said, "is us." Then he pressed a second point, far to the side. "And this," he whispered, "is the future." He connected them with a line, not straight, not curved, just a line. It was enough. A murmur passed through the room, not of excitement, but of deep, grounding calm. The journey from one point to the other would take centuries. Cultures would rise and fall. Languages would change. People would forget the names of the weaver, the rope keepers, the moon watchers, the scribe. But the line would remain. The seed would grow. The patterns would persist. Because the quiet birth of mathematics was never about a single person, a single city, a single moment. It was about the human desire to understand gently, patiently, without fear. As the room emptied, the assistant stayed behind. He placed the last tablet, the one with 2 points and a line, beside the others. He extinguished the lamp. The darkness settled, warm and soft. In that darkness, the seeds of future ages slept: geometry, algebra, mapping, infinity, measurement, resting inside silent clay, waiting for the next curious mind to awaken them. The world outside breathed its slow, ancient rhythm. And mathematics, quiet as ever, continued its patient unfolding. Not born in brilliance or thunder, but in soft footsteps, gentle hands, and whispers passed from one generation to the next. The story ended where it began. In silence. In curiosity. In the unspoken truth that patterns are the universe's lullaby. A lullaby we are still learning to hear.